Welcome to the Neural Implant Podcast, where we talk with the people behind the current events and breakthroughs in brain implants in an understandable way, helping bring together various fields in prosthetics. Here is your host, Ladan.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Neural Implant Podcast. And today's guest is David McMillan, and he is the Director of Education Outreach for the Miami Project. He's also a Research Assistant Professor, Department of Neurological Surgery at the Miami Project. I don't know exactly where that's based. He's going to have to tell us. But yeah, so he's working with a spinal cord injury and looking at the complications, secondary complications of SCI, and then trying to listen in to what SCI populations are trying to say. So, David, this is interesting job title. I don't think I've heard this before. So what are both of your roles? And then where in the world is the Miami Project based?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me, Landon. It's good to be here. Great to meet you at the 2024 American Spinal Injury Association annual scientific meeting that was in Puerto Rico. The Miami Project to Cure Paralysis is a neuroscientific center of excellence for the University of Miami's medical school. It's the Leonard M. Miller School of Medicine. And my department is neurological surgery. So I'm not a neurosurgeon, but we do science with them and in other realms. And that can be relevant to, I think, multiple topics we'll talk about today, especially when it comes to implants. But we seek indications, FDA indications, across all three therapeutic categories. It's device, drug, and biologic. And we have a proven history with all of those. When it comes to implants, you can implant a device. That's pretty obvious. You can implant cells too. You can implant something that delivers drugs, like an intrathecal pump, as an example. Right. So it's kind of, yeah, I think there's a lot to be said here. And then, you say that I'm a professional listener. It feels that way. Miami's flat. It's snowless. There's no state income tax. Most of the buildings were built after ADA law. And we have great hospitals like the one that I'm sitting in right now. So those are like 5 unique incentives why this is a really good place to live if you're paralyzed. So a lot of people move here. So if you want to do clinical trials like I do, you come to where the people are because that's where you can recruit. And so we just have this really rich community of people living with different forms of paralysis here. I work largely with spinal cord injury, but other neurological conditions too. And when you recruit these people into clinical trials, it's kind of like they're Major Tom and you're ground control. Like they're the astronaut and you're launching them on the journey and you support them. And, ground control to Major Tom, you hear ground control call out and you can tell like, wow, they really love that guy, right? You just can't help it. It's intimate and you're doing something really unique with these people. And so when you do that, they just start to talk to you and they disclose things, and some of those things are the things that maybe they haven't been invited by the healthcare system to talk about. Like sexuality is a big one that healthcare system's getting way better at this. But especially in the past, there was just not an invitation, not an open, active kind of urge to talk about that. It would only come up if someone really was digging for it. And so they'll talk to us about these kinds of things because, we just have them as a captive audience in the lab and, we're poking them for this thing or that thing, but they're there and we're all people, right? Science is done by scientists and scientists are people. So yeah, that brings me here and yeah, glad to be here.
Yeah, great. So I guess what is the Miami Project? I don't think I've had anybody on the show from the Miami Project yet. What do you guys do? And are you guys just experimenting on people? Are you putting in the bolts on the neck for Frankenstein? Or are these willing participants? Are you testing things out? Or are you just doing the normal rehabilitation?
Yeah, so many bolts. That's awesome because recently, the way I like to put it is that the engineers are beating the biologists. That's a horrible oversimplification, obviously. Cell biology is extremely important, but there was a push in the past to really go for regenerative cell implants. And I'm talking specifically for spinal cord here. So this would be some type of regenerative cell type implanted, usually in the cord at the level of the injury. So kind of on the MRI where you would see the lesion site or what anatomically you might call a cyst or a fibrotic scar. And those efforts were really important. And it's actually some really important things learned about safety there. FDA, you always approach safety first and then efficacy afterwards. We know that in terms of the phases of the clinical trials. And now there's a recent push and effort, and there's going to be multiple commercialized therapeutic options for clinicians and physicians coming out involving electrical stimulation. So like those bolts in the neck, right? They're delivering the electrical activity, and then Frankenstein's going to be animated and stand up. And we're actually, a lot of those indications have to do with hand function, not so much standing. and even some really cool autonomic functions like blood pressure control. And those will be for blood pressure, some implanted devices in the cord. And there's some really good science recently that came out about how to shape those implants, where exactly to put them, a little bit about intraoperative technique for placing them. And so that's all really exciting science. But yeah, the Miami project is right now we're a collaboration of 37, if you count us all. I think that's including emeritus. So about, let's say, 30 professors, all at the University of Miami. We have two buildings. And as a center of excellence, we are agnostic to method. So my department's neurological surgery. If a neurosurgeon isn't doing surgery, that's pretty much their job, right? So that's a methodological approach. The great thing about a center of excellence at a university is we can find people with different expertise and have them point their expertise at a problem instead of having a technique and then, finding applications for that. So the problem that we point our attention at is paralysis, mostly from spinal cord injury. 1984, young man acquired a spinal cord injury. His dad was very well resourced, very influential person. And when that happened, I imagine, I wasn't there, but I imagine Nick, the father of Mark acquired the spinal cord injury. Nick was like, where's the best neurosurgeon in the world for my son? And Nick was in Miami. And someone was like, weird, that guy's down the street. And it was Dr. Barth Green is who he was referred to. Dr. Green was the chair of neurosurgery coming at the time. I'm not sure. Don't quote me on that. But he eventually became, or was at the time, chair of neurosurgery at University of Miami. And I imagine they got together and they were like, whoa, this is like a lot of serendipity. We have like a lot of momentum here, right? Let's use this disruptive kind of energy of someone acquiring a spinal cord injury and turn that energy into something that's more generative. And so they started this center of excellence, and we've just accumulated experts. I would say, let's say a third, if we're just ballparking it, or sorry, 2/3, my bad. 66% of our efforts are at the basic science and preclinical level. A lot of animal experiments, a lot of cell experiments. Drug discovery, we work all the way down to the chemistry. And then we also have an inpatient rehabilitation hospital where we do human subject research and clinical trials. So we're kind of the full stack of academic, neuroscientific, and neurosurgical applications. It's really cool. And we're in a county hospital. So we're right there along, the clinicians and the physicians. It's really quite a thing to be part of. It's, often referred to us as the Costco of neuroscience. It's like if we have at least one of everything you're looking for, and it's pretty good quality. So,
And the hot dogs are only $1.50.
oh my goodness, the hot dogs.
So, okay, so what percentage? I mean, so you said about 2/3 is the basic science, and then 1/3 is I guess working with the humans. What percentage are you working on? The biologics, the medication, implants, therapies. What does that look like? Who's working with? So, we're interested in neurostimulators. I guess what percentage of the work there is done with neurostimulators, and I guess what can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I can give 3 examples of stimulation projects that we're working with right now that are tangible. Like these, at least technologies will be familiar. Even the companies might be. So one is Onward. Onward Medical Incorporated is a company that's largely based out of EPFL with Grégoire Courtine and Jocelyn Bosch. That's a neuroscientist and a neurosurgeon, respectively. And they recently had a lot of efforts to commercialize 2 products. One is the FDA top line data was submitted. It's called the ARC EX. That's EX for external. That's a transcutaneous spinal cord stimulator intended for movement, and it's upper extremity. So it's hands, reaching, grasping, things like this. Kind of funny because after spinal cord injury, you look at someone in a wheelchair, and if you're not paralyzed, you're like, oh, the problem is obviously their legs because they can't, right? But you ask these people what kind of function they would like to regain. It's a really seminal study published in 2004 showing that if you can't use your hands are your number one thing you want back, which given our modern world with screen-based devices, or so I should say touchscreen devices, keyboards, door handles, feeding yourself, brushing your teeth, okay, that starts to make sense. After that, the next 3 functions are all in the pelvis, bowel, bladder, and sexual function. And after that, you start to get to things in the legs, which I think is really important story, because if you look from the outside at these people and you assume what they need, you can get it wrong. And we did, right? So it's great. I think that Onward through the ARC EX is targeting upper extremity motor function. We were a site. There was 14 sites, pardon, for their clinical trial that will be the pivotal. The top line data was submitted to the FDA And if you look at a lot of the announcements, one of our longtime scientists, physician scientist, Jim Guest, Dr. Guest, is, they're representing the top line data for Onward, including our site and all the other sites. So we were heavily involved in that study. That's great. Another example right now would be SpineX is a company spun out of long-time efforts coming out of UCLA and Dr. Reggie Edgerton, and SpineX is currently seeking the indication of incontinence. And so that's bladder leakage, not volitional voiding, for a transcutaneous spinal cord stimulator that we were a site for their trial right now that hopefully it's a little bit less definitive in terms of the FDA indication pipeline there, but could end up being a pivotal trial for that device as well. So those are two forms of transcutaneous, so that's electrical activity is going across the skin. The device is not implanted. The electrical activity is going in the area of the cord. Whether or not it's going into the cord is a really interesting scientific question. The signals are, but like, is the electricity itself, or is it depolarizing the nerves in the dorsal root area that are actually carrying then their signals into the cord? And those are for two different indications. So one somatic, upper extremity motor function, and the other's autonomic for incontinence, right? I mean, you could say that voiding is kind of like an overlapping autonomic somatic thing, right? Like, but the whole point is we want it to be under control. And then the last, I would say, which involves an implanted device, but maybe you could do this non-invasively as well, would be vagal nerve stimulation. So the vagus, super interesting cranial nerve, touches a lot of things in the viscera. And a lot of times people think about the vagus and they think about efferent information coming from the brain toward the viscera, toward the body. But if you look at the distribution of afferent fibers in the vagus, it's about 85% afferent. It mostly carries information from the body toward the brain. So if you turn this whole nerve on, the whole nerve has all these bundles, but if you just take a stimulator and zap the whole thing, you're getting mostly info going back to the brain. And so you can use that in a really interesting conditioning paradigm to entrain behaviors. And you do it in a way that's independent of motivation. So if you turn on the vagus nerve, you don't feel it go. You're not like, the vagus was stimulated. I feel better. It's not like that. But if you pair that stimulation of the vagus nerve with events of many types, but as one example recently from the stroke literature, and a company out of Texas is commercializing this device. If people are doing rehabilitation, upper extremity, they had a stroke that influences their arms, and they move in a way that a therapist says is good. So let's say it's more force, right, or better coordination, or they're reaching for an object and they have a target, and they hit the target. And you hit the vagal nerve stimulator at the time paired with that event of good movement, you can then condition in that good movement in a way that makes it so that rehabilitation gains are far and above what we would see with the rehabilitation alone. So that's an example of autonomic neuromodulation for somatic motor function. That's like, we're starting to get really abstract with the stimulators now, right? Like we are way up there in like Skinner box meets Olympic athlete kind of world, right? Which I think is really cool. So those are three good tangible examples there, some implanted, some non-invasive. So
yeah, that's pretty cool. That vagus nerve stimulator it reminds me of, I guess, when you're training dogs, you can have a clicker, and that's a much better way to train dogs versus treats, because the treats can take, a little bit longer, 20 seconds to give a treat or something like this, so they don't associate it. So this is like an immediate association.
The timing is really important. Absolutely. Yep. And importantly, though, the vagus, as opposed to maybe some like auricular nerves would carry that clicking information back, the areas anatomically of the brain that the vagus talks to are shown to be, very susceptible to plasticity. So that's one important thing we're trying to tap in there. Really fun in my line of work, having a more rigid differentiation between like neuromodulation, neuroplasticity, and neuroregeneration. Because especially certain areas of neuroscience communication, I'll just hear everyone just throws around the term neuroplasticity like it's just like it's everything, and they like define it out of existence, right? Like this pre-Socratic Greek philosopher, there's this famous statement, all is the moist. What he meant is like everything comes from water, right? And metaphysically, he defined water out of existence by saying everything's water. You can't tell water from anything else. It's like with neuroplasticity. I feel like in the non-technical literature, often that's the case, but the vagal nerve stimulation is really an example of like true neuroplasticity in the brain. So,
yeah, interesting. Yeah, so I don't think I've talked to anybody from, a place that does clinical trials. What does that look like for you guys? Are you guys implanting it? Do you have surgeons doing it? You're taking these devices, or does a company send them? How many people are involved? Are they like living in the place, or do they come in once in a while? I'm very curious about the clinical trial process.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, the answer is yes to all of those. It depends so much on the trial. My boss does a really good job of differentiating between what we call a human study. So human subject research is a term that's used by the federal government, local institutions. So human subject research and clinical trials. So a human study involves people as the volunteers, right? You collect the data from them. A clinical trial is seeking an FDA indication. So it could be a phase one, phase two, phase three, you know, and you can have different permutations of those. But so that's a nice differentiator. For the human studies, usually you wrote a grant or it's investigator initiated, your chair gave you some money and you're trying to characterize something or interested in maybe generating some pilot data or whatever, right? For a clinical trial, often there's a sponsor involved. So industry sponsored studies will have some type of technology that is going to be commercialized, and you have a pretty close to minimal viable product that you're using as the scientist that will be that technology that you're employing will be very similar to what ends up on the market. And you're supposed to use it in the context of kind of how it will be used in clinical practice, as opposed to being very exploratory and more open. And so you're not hypothesis generating when it comes to one of those clinical trials that's especially industry sponsored. So when it comes to the industry sponsored ones, those, that are seeking an FDA indication, there's just a lot of regulatory oversight. That's like probably the number one thing where we have expertise that gives me like a lot of confidence, because if you just came into this and you have a, neuro kind of startup company and you're super excited, you want to, commercialize some kind of device you have an idea for, and you know a ton about the science that's kind of justifying like why you would have this technological approach. One of the first things you're going to run into is just like this. We have these things that they're called regulatory binders. So like one subject, right? Let's say they're in a surgical trial. You can generate like 115 pages worth of documentation in like one day from their participation. And you have to have like initials in this little corner. And if you get the initials wrong, you got to like burn the piece of paper and like print a new one and have everyone reinitial it. And keeping in mind, the people who have to initial it are like the chairs of departments. And you're like running around the whole university to get these initial. And that's just one of the papers, right? So just the regulatory requirements are a lot. But when you have the expertise to do that and get past that, then yeah, you get to a point where maybe people are being paid to relocate to participate in these trials. That definitely happens for the big high impact ones. People could also have just acquired a neurotrauma in our case, and they're going to be living in an inpatient hospital setting regardless, just for their standard of care for a certain amount of time before they can go home and take care of themselves. And you might do studies in that time. So they could be, totally experimentally involved in the clinical trial and in no way receiving what we would call medicine as like a billable medical service through an insurance company. Or they could be receiving medicine because, they had an accident and they got a neurotrauma. And then you're just kind of piling the clinical trial on top of that. And one good example of that for us is targeted temperature management, or what we might call experimental hypothermia. So if you make tissues cold, chemical reactions happen, at a different rate, slower. And most of what happens with the spinal cord injuries is true for the brain as well. After, let's say, a stroke, this actually has been shown to be true for heart attacks. But if you have an initial insult, after that initial insult, there's like a chemical cascade, you might call it inflammatory, that results in secondary damage to an area. That's usually what's resulting in the cause of a scar or something like this. And some of that's good, because if you had an insult to a spinal cord as an example, and then all those cells died and everything in the cells just leaked across the whole, longitudinal axis of the cord, you could like kill the whole cord. So you need to contain the thing, right? Everything's spilling out of these cells. It's no longer in their cytosol. So it's important to contain it. But maybe if you can slow down chemical reactions at that time, you get less of this secondary insult. And so it's kind of hard to chill a whole body. You could also just kill someone with hypothermia. So if you put a catheter into their vein in their leg and you run it all the way up, well, the inferior vena cava is like running next to the spinal column. And if you chill the blood in that area, you're going to chill the cord disproportionately more than the core temperature. And so we do that after people acquire a spinal cord injury here. They're randomized into a study and hopefully they get that, and maybe they don't. And there's a lot of arguments that probably should just be standard of care at this point, because we have like a lot of data on this, but it hasn't quite gotten there. And anyways, that is something that's added on to their pre-existing decompression surgery, alignment, and stabilization that they're probably going to need after their spinal cord injury anyways. So all of those are just their medical care, right? That's not a clinical trial. And then we're adding the hypothermia on top of it. So that's like, one example of how it can go. Other times, yep, they're just in a study. Study has nothing to do with their medicine, and they might be flown in, and the study staff, should write the grants to make it so that these people aren't paying for any of these services. It's just like a big talking point is you can go fly to certain countries, I don't name them, you can find them on the internet, and you can have certain medical procedures done to you. You can have cells implanted in your spinal cord. You can have et cetera, et cetera. And you might be paying somewhere between 40 and $100,000 to have these procedures done. Those are experimental procedures. If they weren't, they would be standard of care here in the States. And in the States, if you're participating in a clinical trial, this is just like an FYI PSA. You should not be paying to be in that clinical trial. So that's like a coercive type of balance that we try and find. So,
Yeah, interesting. I mean, it makes sense. Yeah, like if somebody's experimenting on you, then you shouldn't, and they're trying to figure something out, they should be able to foot the bill for this. But yeah, that's really interesting. Okay, so what do you see as being kind of the most, I don't know, promising? And then I guess what's your opinion on neuromodulation versus the other? You kind of mentioned stem cell therapies and other things. What's your opinion of the field?
combinations are going to be required. We know that both from our kind of monotherapeutic approaches in people and also from what's more advanced that works in animals that acquire neurotrauma experimentally. If you combine therapies, you can get amazing outcomes. In non-human animals, it's really challenging to combine things in people, and there's a good explanation for that. It's not challenging so much, it's time consuming because we're required to do this. If you test four things at the same time and only good things happen, you don't necessarily have to attribute exactly what proportion of the good thing was to each of the four different combined therapies. But if you test four things at the same time and one bad thing happens, well, you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. So you need to know what's doing what. And so because of that, we're kind of forced in people to test one, two, three, four, and then one and two, one and three, one and four, and then two and three and two and four. And then that takes a lot of time if each of those it's its own standalone clinical trial. But that's because the societal norms that we've all kind of assumed bias safety in front of reward in the context of medical therapeutics. So there we go. That's I think the future for sure is going to be combined. I also think that there's something of a shift happening right now where almost all of these therapeutics are being viewed as rehab adjuvants. And what I mean by that is it used to be in the past that like, hey, we're going to put these cells in, the cells are going to cure you. Hey, we're going to zap you with this stimulator, and the stimulator is going to cure you. Now and this is well supported by animal research as well, that unless you're pairing those therapeutics with meaningful movement, that those therapeutics they don't take full effect. They don't realize themselves. So it's really that this cell is going to help the rehab cure you. This stimulator is going to help the movement cure you. And all of these trials now, the stimulation is paired with movement, or the stimulation is paired with an event like we were saying with the VNS, or the cells are put in and there's a prehab period and then there's an intensive rehab period afterwards to inform the therapeutic that's going in so that it's doing something that's meaningful instead of just, take two, call me in the morning kind of approach that, from the past is famous in medicine. Really, there's a huge shift in neuroscience now to be seeing almost all of these therapeutic categories as rehabilitation adjuvants. So that's something I definitely see coming in the future. Combinations and everything paired with rehab, for sure, those things are here to stay.
Yeah, I have kind of a strange opinion on this. Like I think medicine almost doesn't match, or it isn't compatible with the scientific method, because scientific method is like you're changing one thing, you're isolating one thing, but biology is meant to overcome and adapt and everything like this. So a lot of times if you remove one thing, the biology can adapt, and so yeah, you do need these combinatorial approaches, and yeah, like you said, it's much more difficult, but hopefully with AI and machine learning one day it'll solve everything. But yeah, I also want to talk about, what is this director of education and outreach? What does this mean, and how did you get into this position? I think your background is very interesting, getting into the Miami project too.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Landon. When you have a center like ours with so much momentum and we're so successful with our grant writing and our private fundraising as well, and You can then have a position like mine. So part of that is kind of an administrative position where I engage various stakeholders, anyone who cares about these technologies that are being developed in the context of paralysis, to try and just orient them toward our mission. If they share, some part of our mission, then just invite them to join us in this journey, and with whatever they can offer, see how they might plug in. So there's a lot of just networking and connecting being done there. But another part of it, a really big part of it, is recruitment for clinical trials. So think about the education component, not so much like university education, but more like education in the informed consent process is a big part of it. So we have right now, let's just say, over 24 active studies that are recruiting. Some are as simple as a survey on the internet. Other ones are an elective neurological surgery to put something in your brain when there's nothing wrong with your brain. So it's a pretty wide spectrum. And the person who has the expertise with the sociology for the survey is probably not going to speak the same language as the neurosurgeon who's doing the implant, and vice versa. And so I'm kind of the jack of all, the 80% across all 10 categories instead of 10 out of 10 on one category type of person. So that if someone who might qualify for these trials comes to us, I can talk to them about their goals. I can talk to them about what they would like to get out of participation in our trials. And then I can start to align them with certain laboratories that might fit, where they're going to be a good candidate for participation, where there's going to be synergy, and everyone's going to get something out of it. So that's a big part of my job, is just, coordinating across labs in terms of recruitment. And that's a good problem to have. Normally, if you're at if you're at a university that doesn't have a center like this, each lab is kind of doing its own recruitment in a way where sometimes, because if you're working with a niche, like a not so common patient population, it can get a little competitive instead of cooperative. And so, Eleanor Ostrom is like one of my major arcana. She's amazing. Anyways, Nobel Prize in managing common pool resources. And a lot of what I'm just trying to do is keep the cooperation going, both within like an in-reach part and between the people we work with in the outreach component. So yeah, if you can find a center at a university that has a position like this, it's amazing, but it's really uncommon, because it's not that common for, something started in the 1980s to, achieve success, to continue its trajectory, and to have so much kind of like history and trust that they would pop up a position like this one. So look for them. They definitely exist. But
Yeah, it definitely sounds interesting. So are you also recruiting patients too? Are you, or is that another position, or are you more recruiting, or you're mediating, I don't know, communications between once they're already recruited, or what does that look like?
No, it's like pre-recruitment. We might call it like pre-screening or something like this. I have an office, multiple employees, and some of them will go into the inpatient rooms every time there's a new, neurotrauma or paralysis in our hospital, and they'll be like, hey, just wanted to let you know, there's a group of researchers. If you want to participate in a clinical trial, we can answer any of your questions. And then we also just have like an open kind of community center on the first floor of the hospital, and anyone with paralysis can come and just check that out. They can use some free services, and the kind of understanding there is a quid pro quo is that we can try and recruit them into studies. So there might be someone down there and like, hey, if you want to participate in a study, we can talk to you, let us know. So that's kind of like pre-recruitment almost. That falls into the director of outreach part.
Okay. Cool. David, is there anything that we didn't talk about that you wanted to mention? Any final parting thoughts?
No, just I'll re-invoke, consider the cord when it comes to neuro. It seems to me for certain areas that it's all brains. And at least if you look at some of the work like with spinal cord neurobiology, independent of the injury, but central pattern generators, the cord is not just a conduit. It's a series of compute. It does math. It's smart. It's not just something that's carrying a signal from the brain to the body. It is changing that signal as it goes. It's adding or subtracting information. So yeah, consider the cord in your neuroscience. And yeah, Landon, if you end up seeking, trials for a device, you know where to find us.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, thank you so much. And thank you so much for coming on.
All right, pleasure.
Hope you enjoyed the show and were able to learn something new, bringing together different fields in novel ways. Until next time on the Neural Implant Podcast.